I'm Bernie Van Loo, and I was born in 1927. In our family, there was 6 boys, no girls. I'm the second to the youngest, and I'm the only one left now. Bill was the oldest, then Hank, and then Gerald, and then John, and then I, and then Ray. I'll tell you, now Ramey and Johnny and I, we was going to the muck, you know, and we had an old truck. And Ramey and Johnny was sitting in the back, and I didn't have no driver's license. We was young kids. And boy, they hollered, here comes the state patrol, he's on a motorcycle. So boy, I went and I opened the thing up and we went flying. And we went to turn by the canal. Well, I didn't make it. We flipped right in the ditch.
Did the policeman talk to you?
No, it wasn't a policeman, it was just a guy on a motorcycle. It was a Newmeyer's farm right there, right by the canal. We'd go way back in there, and that's where we'd go swimming.
Did you ice skate on the canal?
No. No, we usually went over by, towards Shelby, on that pond out there right below that hill. It's not a pond no more, but that's where we used to go. And then Sherman's Hill up by Plymouth, that's that steep hill. That's where we used to go with our skis and sleds. I didn't ski, but Harry Sharpus, he had some skis. So him and I went there one day after school. His dad let us use the car. And he went down and ran right into a bunch of, whole bunch of fence that had it all in a pile there. And that's what he ran into, I remember that. He got scratched up and broke his ski, but then that was the end of that. There was 2 stores in Celeryville too. Well, it was John Lewis's on one end, and Ann Franson was on the other. I remember one time I was late for supper. And Dad says, well, you're late, you don't get anything. I said, okay. So I went out, and I went to Ann Franson's, and I got a pound of bologna. And I went home and I sat underneath the front porch, and we had a dog too, a shepherd, you know. And he sat there with me, and I couldn't eat it all, so I just gave it to him. He ate a whole pound of bologna. I remember we were just little kids. We had a goat, and I thought, well, man, I'm going to hook him up to the cart, put Ramey in it, and then we'll go. So I did. And that goat must have been watching us kids, where we always went to Grandma's, you know. So I hooked him up on that cart, and I put a rope to the cart, and man, he took off. When I put Ramey in that cart, he just took off, and I couldn't catch him. He went to the road, and he went on the road okay. But then when we got to Grandma's house, he hit the curb and dumped Ramey out on the road. I remember that yet. We were small then. I got him up. We went into Grandma's, and the old goat stood right there by the porch waiting for us to come out again. Well, I met Margaret. Corwin and I, they had a carnival uptown, you know. And Corwin had a date with a girl there. And so he asked me to go along, so I went, and we went. Margaret was with her. Well, then that's how we met. It must have been about 17, because Corwin had a driver's license too. And Corwin and I are about the same age. In fact, his birthday was in May and mine was in October. We was about 5 months apart. And Corwin and I, we ran around quite a bit together.
Did all your brothers have to go to war?
No, just Johnny. Well, there was Hank and Johnny and I, just the 3 of us. Wow. And Ramey, he went too, but Gerald and Bill, they didn't go. No. Bill, he didn't pass the exams. And Gerald, he worked for Werther's at that time. Yeah. But then there was 4 of us, we went. Now, Ramey and I, we went to the Korean War. And Johnny and Hank, they were in the Second World War. Hank, he got shot in the neck. Well, Hank told me one time that they was going through a woods, And that's the only time he ever said anything, because I really pinned him down to ask him about something. And he said, oh, they was going through the woods, and they was going to that prison camp. They was going to free that prison camp, that big prison camp. And he says, we were the first ones there. But he says, going through the woods, I got shot in the neck. And he said, but we were the first ones at that. Hank, he never said too much about anything. That's the only thing I ever got out of him. See, everybody was gone, and Dad rented 5 acres, and we had 5.5 acres, and Dad and I was about the only ones left, because Hank and Johnny and Ray, he was too small. But then, now Gerald, he worked for Worthy, so Dad and I was trying to run that farm. Well, then when I went to Korea, he sold it when I was gone, so he sold it to Worthy. Well, Dad raised celery and everything, but towards the end we just had carrots and onions.
Okay.
Mostly. If they didn't sell too good, Dad always made a big pit. And then he'd put straw over it, and then he'd put that carrots in there. Then he'd put straw on it and then dirt on that. And then in the wintertime you could go in and get some carrots, and it was good.
And where did you go to high school?
In New Haven. But I didn't graduate.
No?
You know, because I went to the 9th grade. It was way late in September, 1st of October, before I was done. And man, in school, I was about a month behind everything. Mm-hmm. Then in the spring, in March, you had to get out of school again to help stuff. So I just lost interest. Well, then I just thought, man, I'm so far behind, I'm not even going to go to school, so I didn't. I quit. A whole bunch of us. Corwin didn't, and well, there was Harley and Donnie Moll, and I was 15 when I got out. And Dave, well, he was in Columbus all the time, and finally that doctor, he was head over all the cancer victims in there. And he told us, he says, Dave isn't going to live too much longer. And we had a talk, and he says, you only live a little ways from the hospital. And he says, and I'll get the release, and I'll set it all up. I'll get the ambulance, or the emergency squad, and we'll take him right to Willard. And he said, I'll set up everything. And I'll call Willard and tell him what medication he is. April the 4th is when we took him down here, because of Margaret's birthday, and the 12th he died. Well, anyhow, at last night, I was sitting there on the chair, right beside the bed. He was sitting there, and he leaned way over in front of me, and he's looking all down through the room on me, and then he looked on the other side, and then he laid down again. Well, before that, he didn't even have the strength to sit up and drink. If he wanted to drink, I'd hold him up and Margaret would give him the water. When he did that, I thought, boy, he's getting stronger all of a sudden. And I told him, I said, Dave, if you want anything, I'll get it for you. You want a nurse or whatever? And he never said a word. And he laid there about 5 minutes. Then he got up again, and he stretched way out and he tried to look down the hall. And I thought, what's going on here? When he woke up the second time, he said, Dad, I had the most wonderful conversation. Then he laid back down for about, well, I'd say maybe a couple minutes. And then looked up at me and he said, Dad, what did you want? And I said, I didn't want anything. I said, I thought you did. Well, that was the last words he said. Then he passed away. And I think the Lord was calling him.
And he was looking for him.
Yeah. And then she taught, and she had both legs amputated. She's at the hospital, and she was in the recovery room for 5 days. She was unconscious, and Margaret and I, we stayed right there at the hospital. And one time, about the 5th day, we was down there because we could only be in there for 5 minutes. Then we had to leave twice a day is all they'd allow us. We stand there one time, and I felt her starting to try to hold my hands, to grip my hand. And I told Margaret, said, no, it wasn't. Well, then when she came to, I asked her, I said, Debbie, you remember of you trying to grip my hand? She says, yeah. She said, I tried to, but she said, I didn't have no strength. Could you feel it? And I says, yeah. She said, I knew I was doing it. And then she had that experience with going through the tunnel. And she says, when I was going through the tunnel, I got halfway through and I stopped. And then the Lord asked me if I was ready to go, if I had anything more to do. And she says, you know, that was the hardest decision to make. I wanted to go because she says, when I was in there, I didn't have no pain. She said, it's a wonderful feeling. But she told me, she said, yes, there's one thing I'd like to do. When I said that, she said, all of a sudden I started feeling, but that's when she was in that recovery room, yeah. Her legs was cut off, you know, she wasn't teaching no more. And she said, Dad, I'd like to go to the mall and see if I can get some clothes, different clothes. I said, okay. So her and Margaret and I went, and I seen a young girl running down the aisle, you know, and I didn't know she was coming to us. And all of a sudden she turned and she grabbed hold of Deb. I must have looked at her kind of funny, because that girl turned around and looked up at me and she said, I want to tell you something. She said, this young lady changed my whole life. She said, I'm dope. She says, and she talked to me and she changed my whole life. When she left, I asked Deb about her. And she says, yeah, she's a real smart girl. She's getting all A's until the center of her sophomore year. And all of a sudden started dropping. Well, in the junior year, she came back and she wasn't doing really good. And I told her, I says, I'm going to stay here after school out in my room for an hour afterwards, and I'd like for you to come and we'll talk it over. Well, she did. Well, Debbie says at one time, she asked if she should take her home. And Deb says, yeah, I'll take you home. So Deb says, you know, I took her home. We went in the house and her mother was real pleasant, real nice. But here her dad came drunk. He cussed and swearing, she says, and he's throwing stuff. And she says, right there, I knew what happened, how she, you know, why she turned that way. But she said when she was halfway through her junior year, she changed. And then in the senior year, she got all A's again. After her funeral, they called us up. And they says, well, we got a tree and a rock and everything, and we're going to put it outside of her room by her window. That's a school. Yeah, she did a lot of good. See, Debbie was married twice.
Okay.
Her first husband, they was only married, I'd say about 8 months, and he died of cancer. Jack Jones, that was her first husband. He was 1 year ahead of her. Well, then he went to Louisville, Kentucky, for college down there to be a dentist. Well, then they got married, and then they lived in Louisville. One time, he had to have a test, and he was sick, and he couldn't make it, and he called him up. And he said, if I send my wife after a test, would you give it to her? And I says, yeah. Debbie went after it. She looked at it, she said, man, what's this test about? And Jack says, it's all in this book. And Debbie said, can I read that book? And Debbie was a fast reader. In fact, one time I was watching her and she was reading a book. I says, what are you doing, looking at the pictures? Pictures? There are no pictures. I says, well, you can't be reading that. Yes, I am. I said, let me have your book. So I got that book, and I started reading the sentence, and she finished it.
She had a photographic memory.
When she got that book for Jack, she read that and probably a day, and then she took the test for Jack. And turned it in, and she got an A out of it. And then she came home, and she was living here, and one day, Ed stopped out in front, and because then they could park out in front there. He stopped out, and he came to the door, and he says, he said, I want to get some clothes that jumps. And he said, would you want to go along with Deb? Deb said, yeah, I'll go along with this. So that's when it started, and then they got married. Ed, now her husband, he traveled a lot. Whenever he did, we'd go down and stay with her. We just took her to the dialysis in the phone rang, and here it was Ed. And he said, well, I'm here at the airport in Toledo.
He said, if you folks want to go home, they can go home, because I'll be there in about 5 minutes. So we took off. We got home, just in the house, and the phone rang, and that was Ed. And he said, Mark, Debbie just passed away. So Mark said, let's go back. So we went right back when she was gone. She's something else. So I got good thoughts of both of them, you know.
You must have been a pretty good dad.
I don't know how the kids were. Really, Mark really raised them.
No, it's, go through life, you know, there's a lot of different experiences. God leads you through all of them. It really makes you think, you know, and especially when when I'm sitting here by myself, you know, think of all that stuff, reminisce, just like with the kids.